Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of the Faith Roundtable. I'm your host, Josh Burtram, and today I get the pleasure of interviewing Bryan Loritts. Dr. Bryan Loritts is the teaching pastor at the Summit Church. He's an award-winning author of 8 books. He's spent most of his ministry serving and resourcing the multi-ethnic church. He co-founded Fellowship Memphis in 2003 and serves as the president of the Kainos Movement, an organization committed to seeing multi-ethnic church become the new normal. His ministry takes him across the globe annually as he speaks at conferences, churches, and retreats. Loritts has been a featured speaker for Catalyst and at the Global Leadership Summit. Currently, he serves on the board of Biola University and is a regular visiting professor at Grimke Seminary. He's also the vice president of regions for the Send Network, the church planting arm of the SBC, where he's responsible for training church planners and multi-ethnic church planting. And today we're interviewing about his new book, Enduring Friendships, Sticking Together in an Age of Unfriending, which is going to talk about the nuances of different friendship types and a theological depth of Christian teachings on friendship. Bryan, thanks so much for coming on the program today.
Well, Josh, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And I got to say, I'm a church planner, so it's really awesome to be able to talk to someone who has such ties in the church planting world. And also, I am striving, and we are striving at our church to maintain diversity, to maintain multi-ethnic, different thought patterns, different ways of living and lifestyles, and trying to figure out how to maintain friendships and relationships and work through all the complexity that comes along with it. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, to be honest with you. And, I got to ask, with all that experience that you have, what made you want to write a book about friendship? What's going on? What inspired you to do that and felt like the church needed that at this time?
Well, I think there's many reasons. I actually think at the top of the list is probably a reason you might not expect. And that is, I once read an author say that he writes to figure out what he thinks about a given subject. And,
I
that
understand that.
resonated deeply with me. I think people make the assumption of writers that we are the experts on a subject. And in a lot of ways, that's not always true. And so very much so, in fact, in the opening pages of my book, Enduring Friendship, the reader is surprised to see that I'm kind of knocking myself off of any kind of pedestal you might have put me on, that I'm the expert of friendships, because the analogy I really use, which is a true one from life, are a lot of friendships that have just gone wrong in my
Mm,
life, and for multiple reasons. And those that have gone south, it's not always because it was the other person's fault. I
right.
played a heavy hand into this. So, if for no one else, to answer your question, I wrote this book for me. And then finally, I'll just say, we're living in an age of what some philosophers call expressive individualism.
Hmm.
We are becoming more and more inward. And of course, a part of what goes along with that is a pronounced felt loneliness. And so I
Yes.
think this idea of relationships is becoming more and more of a felt need.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In our church, we've tried to build this on relationships, build this on discipleship relationships, and relationships are difficult. They're hard. They're very messy. It can get really complicated, especially if someone starts doing something that you didn't expect or starts kind of distancing themselves. It can create a lot of tension. And, the whole even idea of friendship in church, and I've heard different people, be like, pastors really shouldn't be friends with their congregation. I'm a pastor. And, I've never thought that was a good model or method to go by. but I've heard that stated, and it just the reason I bring that up is like there's a lot of confusion. I think even about friendships, it's like it's almost like it's something that we are just like we intuitively and naturally gain friendships, but we never really stop to think about how to think about friendships and how to think about relationships. And I'm wondering, you know, is there in the study and research that you did, like how would you even categorize or even define friendship, even though it feels like that should be a very basic thing? How would you define friendship and kind of what's the kind of history of thinking on friendship? What have you found out?
Yeah, actually, I think your question gets right to the heart of the matter, and it feels weird because I don't think people put that much thoughtfulness into really what is it that
Yeah.
I'm looking for. The ancient Celts, they had a phrase, an expression that really gets to the heart of your question, and that is the phrase in Anam Cara. And pretty much what they meant by the phrase Anam Cara is it's a kind of friend that was a soul level friend.
Hmm.
So it's not just an acquaintance. It's not just somebody you go out and have a meal with. It's actually someone that you are sharing your life with, your full self with. There's a sense of vulnerability and transparency. These are soul level friendships. Aristotle, in his classic friendship ladder, he talks about really two kinds of friendships. At the most superficial level, it's what he calls utilitarian friendships. The
Hmm.
idea there is people who are in my life for a specific purpose. I'm thinking in the most basic sense, the flight attendant or the barista. They are in my life really to
Right.
facilitate something with me. Now we can take that to another extreme and just talk about the amount of people in our life who we either think we're their friend or they are our friend when the truth of the matter is they're really using us for something. This falls into Aristotle's utilitarian friendship category. But then at the deepest levels is what Aristotle calls your perfect friendships. And it's really this concept of an anam cara. It's a person you are just fully exposed to. There's a sense of deep level transparency and vulnerability again, and that's a two-way street. And the last thing I'll say along these lines, Josh, and it's really important that people get this. Social scientists actually say we only have enough capacity for about three, no more than five of those in our
Hmm.
lives. So, sorry, extroverts, for those of you who've never met a stranger in your life, the book of Proverbs actually warns against having too many friends. There does come a point in which you have just overextended yourself and you can't do the deep work that is necessary with these soul level anam caras, these perfect friendships, as Aristotle talks about. So that's a great question. And that book, the book that I wrote, is really focused on nurturing those three to five.
So, how can we first recognize which um how can we first recognize which friendships we have fit into that category, and then what steps can we take to start to like nurture them? What does nurturing look like?
Yeah, C.S. Lewis in his wonderful book, The Four Loves, he talks about how friendship begins on a note of you too. And what he's getting at there is this profound sense of affinity, right? So just imagine, you're meeting someone for the first time, you're sensing this organic sense of connection. And there's just this sense of, oh, you too, you like that too, or you listen to that too. And so I think what this note of affinity does is it really dismisses the whole notion that I can kind of choreograph or planning center these kinds of relationships when in reality you can't. Which, by the way, I think that's why a lot of people find themselves frustrated with kind of a church's small group ministry, because I think for some people they get
Hmm.
into a small group thinking this is going to be my people, and at the end of the day, you can't structure or plan that. Uh, there is an organic sense in which you either resonate or click with someone or you don't. So I would say there's got to be that sense of affinity that's there. And once you feel like that affinity is reciprocated, I think over a period of time, there does need to, at some point, I would say months down the road, maybe a year down the road, I think you need to have what we call a DTR. That's this whole idea of defining the relationship.
Hmm.
And that is, I'm not talking romantically. I'm just saying, I think most friendships fail because they're just not intentional, right? And I think the scripture for this is 1 Samuel chapter 18. Of course, 1 Samuel 17, David has just killed Goliath. The opening verses of 1 Samuel 18 talks about how Jonathan's soul was knitted to David's soul. And then it goes on to say how they formed a covenant. They made a covenant with one another. They formalized it. They had the DTR. They said, listen, we sense something here. We want to be in each other's lives. And this beautiful friendship takes off, but it doesn't just happen. They actually made a covenant and said, let's just formalize this and let's be in each other's lives.
Man, that is fascinating. So, like, I'm trying to imagine myself going to someone and having this conversation. Like, hey, let's define the relationship. And well, I'll give you an example. So, like, there was a while back where I kind of had like this concept of defining the relationship was given to me by a mentor. I didn't really like have a lot of real thought into it. I didn't process it very much. And kind of to my style, I just kind of jumped into it and said, "Hey, let me define this relationship." There's someone that I was kind of mentoring myself, and I was like, "Yeah, I think we should define the relationship." And then it kind of just like stopped after that point, after that conversation, and it felt like there was like an awkwardness to it that was really difficult. And I'm just wondering, like, when we have those kinds of conversations, what does that look like? How can we prepare ourselves and others for those kind of conversations? Like, how do we get past the potential awkwardness and move on to something like more fruitful when we are defining those relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that you actually hit on is there's always a sense of risk here, right? Whenever you extend yourself and just go, I want to be more intentional here. You run the risk of the person on the other side of the table saying in so many words, yeah, I don't really feel that. And
Yeah.
um, I wish there was a foolproof way to avoid that when the truth of the matter is there's just not a foolproof way to avoid that. That's why I would just say you don't lead out with that. I think you've got to allow for a lot of time to transpire. And in that time, you need to be able to discern, is this just me? Is there a sense of chemistry here with this person? And then once you extend yourself, one of the things that I like saying is, hey, listen, man, this has just been a ball. I want to keep this going. But maybe here are some needs that I have. Some men might actually say, is there any way we can actually formalize a time, and a part of that time is just maybe a good meal where we drift off into some accountability stuff. Or maybe there's a
Hmm.
book that we can actually work through. I think there are some specific things that what specificity does is it takes the pressure off that just an ambiguous kind of generalized statement like, hey, can we just be more intentional? I think doing the work to just say, here's some needs of mine, and here's how I think being more intentional and what that looks like. I actually think that level of clarity will take the pressure off on the other person. So now they're hearing things like, okay, yeah, I think I can do a meal once a week or once every other week. Yeah, doing that book study sounds great. So I would think through exactly what it is you're asking of that person.
And so, would it be appropriate to basically look at almost like do a mind map of all my relationships that I have and to kind of see what do I want from these relationships? What do I need from these relationships? And what kind of conversations would be beneficial to help define that relationship more? Is it a process that specific, or should it be more based on intuition?
So this is, explain that again. You recently met somebody?
No, like say, like, is it appropriate, sorry, to basically look at all my relationships and like basically do a mind map of my relationships and then try to work through like how do I need to define each of these relationships? Is that like
Um, so that might work for some people, and I want to be very careful about
sure?
moralizing the process, right? I don't think you're wrong if you do that. I don't think someone is necessarily right if they do that. That's why I like talking about the 3 to 5. And in that, here's an inescapable thing of life, and it doesn't make you disingenuous. The more I talk to people about their friendships, the more I realize that what is pretty normal for most people is almost like a mismatch kind of a friendship. You will always have
Hmm.
people who maybe think they're closer to you than what they actually are, or
Yes.
vice versa, right? And I don't feel like we need to necessarily have a conversation about that, right?
Hmm.
Um, it's only conversation worthy when I feel like you're asking me to give something that I just don't have the bandwidth to give. And again, I
Hmm.
think clarity is your friend there. But when I'm processing my 3 to 5, I do think that mind map is helpful. But I also think that you probably have a general sense already. And it's just, again, friendships are just this thing in which you either click with a person or you don't,
Yes.
right? And I think you have a general idea of, man, who you really enjoy. Like if I said to you, Josh, um, hey, Josh, all of a sudden 5 hours this week has opened up on your calendar, and you get to spend 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 hours with someone outside of your bride or one of your kids. I think you have an idea of who you would like that person to be.
Yeah.
And chances are that's the person, if they're not already your Anam Cara, that's the person that you want to nurture this enduring friendship.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And like how does someone deal with the almost maybe like the guilt that might come with just looking at my relationships and realizing, oh yeah, this one's really more transactional. Like it seems like most of our relationships are going to be transactional in nature,
Yeah.
right? They're either going to be like they're going to offer us something. Like I think about myself as a pastor, and I love the people in my that are in my congregation. I feel very close to them. As it grows, that closeness won't be possible anymore, with everyone. And sometimes I'll be honest, I do feel like, man, this just feels so transactional sometimes. And there's a guilt that comes with that. Like I should be more genuine or more authentic or more able to accommodate more relationships. And especially when you're in a position like mine where people will come and they'll tell you some of their deepest things that are going on in their life. And so you feel this, like they feel this closeness, and you kind of feel like appreciative of that. And it feels kind of guilt. There's a sense of like, oh, this feels kind of disingenuous, or I feel kind of bad that I see some of these relationships as transactional. How have you kind of found how to navigate those feelings, or do you have any
Well,
input on that?
yeah, I think there's a couple things. As a pastor myself, I definitely know the tension that you're feeling. Um, so one thing I would say is I think there are so many people in our culture who confuse authenticity with transparency. And I would say, Josh, we're called to be authentic with everyone,
Hmm.
but transparent with few, right?
Hmm.
So let me give you a biblical example of this. When I think about Jesus, the night he's betrayed, there's 11 disciples left. Judas has gone off to do the betraying. Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he leaves 8 of the disciples at the gate, and he takes Peter, James, and John with him into the garden. And all the gospel writers are clear that it's at this moment with just Jesus and Peter, James, and John, it says that he began to be sorrowful and troubled. In other words, those three only saw a side of Jesus emotionally that the other 8 did not see.
Hmm.
He was authentic with everyone, but there was a depth of transparency in that moment that only those 3 could be. And so I actually think, there's a famous proverb that says, guard your heart. I actually think it's irresponsible, Josh, for anyone, and we'll just peel the pastor label off, but for
Sure.
anyone to be transparent with a whole lot of people, right? I'd like to believe I'm authentic with everyone. Not everyone knows how much money I make. You know what
Right.
I'm saying? Not everyone knows my shadow side, but someone should
Hmm.
know. Someone should know. And I think that's just wisdom. The other thing I would offer to you, Josh, is I would say take the pressure off. You open up the conversation about saying pastors and friendships with the people that they pastor. And I think
Yeah.
I think that's a great question that each pastor needs to wrestle through. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to that. However, I do think what complicates it isn't so much the pastor thing as much as it is the multiple hats thing.
Hmm.
That's what complicates it. That's why, most CEOs are incredibly lonely people. The more hats you wear, the harder it is to have friendships. Kyle Idleman says the more you are perceived as the one giving help, the less help you actually get,
Hmm.
right? And so, um, I have found in my own life, it's not that I don't have the desire to be friends with the people I pastor. Oftentimes, they can't handle the multiple hats that I wear. So, for
Hmm.
example, can I bare my soul to you and actually talk to you about my sin struggles? And then you take notes from me when I preach on holiness.
Right.
You, you know what I'm saying? That's a tough thing. Or can I be friends with a staff member, right? And we go out and we share matters of the heart. And then there's times when I need to shift gears and hold you accountable to your performance on the job. Like those are some very complicated things that I think we should take out of a pastor box and just put in a multiple hats box.
Yeah, that is so good because, I mean, dealing with the nature of our relationships is so much of what we have to work through in life, just in general. And most of us just don't have any path to do it, any tools to do it. We just kind of do it intuitively. Well, this person stopped talking to me, therefore they must think this. We make assumptions, and then we make choices based on our assumptions about that relationship that continue that relationship. Like we could choose to reach out to that person and see if they wanted to hang out, or we could choose to not talk to them again. But either way, like these assumptions that we're making start to drive our own choices, which then kind of further either like they further define the relationship essentially or create the nature of the relationship. And it's tough. And you're thinking about people in leadership, and Jesus was certainly a person that was in leadership, and he calls his disciples friends. And I know this is something that you kind of talk about within the book, and So how does the model of Jesus help us kind of make sense of finding those 3 to 5 and defining the other relationships that we inevitably are going to have in our walk, in our Christian walk, in our professional life, and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, so of course, the caveat here with any example of Jesus is he had no shadow side, right? Um,
Right.
he did not have a sin nature or any of that. So we're talking about the perfect person. Um, and so I just want to be clear with that. Um, but hey, I think pastors, along with everybody else, should be just open to soul level friendships, no matter what environment or context they come from. The first thing I tell people, especially if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, is you need to make this a deep matter of prayer. I mean, because I believe one of the primary ways God uses to develop us to be more like Him is through other people. So, who you let into your life is huge. Craig Groeschel says, we will only become the aggregate of our 5 closest friends. It's that classic line, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. Friendships are powerful. I was even meditating on Psalm 1 this morning and how it just opens up, blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the way of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. I mean, it opens up by just kind of giving this massive warning about who you congregate with, who you hang out with, who you do
Yes.
life with. And so, one of the things I pray for my young adult sons is God give them great friends and give them great discernment as it relates to who those friendships are. Um, you know, there are a lot of people probably listening to this, and I think the reality of just people in general, because we all have sin natures, we're all going to get bumps and bruises along the way. And I think one of the messages of Satan is when that thing happens is to whisper in our ear, see, you can't trust people and therefore give up on the whole project of friendship. I just want to say that's not of God. Both Psalms and Proverbs talk about the person who isolates themselves is a fool.
Hmm.
I mean, Genesis opens up by God saying it's good, it's good, it's good. And then the one time he says it's not good is when man is alone. And
Yeah.
so we were created for community. And what I don't want to get into is a posture that rejects this because I'm talking out of a sense of woundedness. And yes, there's a place to get healed up and healthy and whole. But we got to make sure that we're able to stay positive and trusting God and being open to what that might look like.
Yeah, that's really good. One of the concepts that you explore is the concept of I will and I did, talking about kind of mirroring the commitment of Jesus' ultimate act of friendship. What does that mean? Kind of explain the concept to us, and how can this concept be modeled in the relationships that we have with our closest people?
Yeah, so I think that question makes me pause initially and just bring out a reality of relationships, and that is, I think for most people, friendships are more seasonal than anything else.
Yeah.
Um, and that's okay. That's okay. Friendships are like running a marathon, and there's these water stations at pivotal moments along the journey. Those are your friends. They give you a cup of cold water. They run with you for a leg of the journey, and then they kind of drift out of the way. Not everyone is meant to be with you over the long haul. And so when I talk about our I wills and I dids, it's kind of an analogy of people who stood with me on my wedding day when I said, I will, and they served as witnesses to me, and then my pallbearers, people who will lower
Hmm.
me in the grave. And the idea there is, very rarely is the person who will stand with you on your wedding day and witness kind of the most pivotal human moment in your life, and that same person lower you into the grave. That's rare. And that gets to this idea of
Yes.
Anam Caras. Your Anam Caras transcend seasons of your life. They are with you no matter what that season of your life looks like, which is why I think by very definition, they're smaller and fewer in number.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You had mentioned CEOs that feel very lonely. CEOs can be feel very lonely. I know pastors can feel very lonely. It creates a an atmosphere rather where essentially this loneliness, this kind of separation because of the multiple hats that you have to wear, this separation that can happen, and no one can end up really knowing that pastor. And many people that have fallen into very sinful lifestyles and it's all come out, part of that is potentially not having these relationships of accountability and these deep relationships where there's total transparency when someone's speaking into your life. And so much of our lives, especially as we gain more success, if we gain more success, but even just at any point, like as you grow older and you see that certain people, their relationships are temporary, that certain people will be there and most won't, and that certain people are just after you or just in this relationship because it is transactional, right? They're getting something and and maybe you're getting something too. How can we kind of guard against superficial interactions and kind of instead foster deep, more genuine connections when we're going through our relationships, to even be able to find those few people, like even seasonally, those few people that are gonna have that kind of relationship with us? What do we do to kind of guard against superficiality?
That's a great question, and that's where I think going back to what we talked about a few questions ago, having a DTR, um, having a sense of intentionality that frames the relationship, and pressing down into what that intentionality looks like. Again, for some people, that's accountability. For some people, it's like, man, I really want to do this Proverbs 27 thing of iron sharpening iron. And is there some kind of a book study that we can do together? Maybe we build into our time some times of prayer. Maybe, to be quite honest with you, it's just being more intentional and thoughtful about the questions that we
Hmm.
ask one another. Or the other way around, going, hey, here's some questions that I just need you to ask me from time to time. I think that degree of thoughtfulness, if we don't have that, especially as guys, we'll just slip into conversations built around our favorite sports teams or whatever superficial thing it is. And don't get me wrong, I think there's very much a place of fun that should remain in the relationship, right?
Right.
So I'm not coming down on sports. I am just saying for so many men, it just doesn't get deeper than that. And it really just has to go deeper. And that's where intentionality, thoughtfulness, and then building some time to actually take a deep dive with one another into it is huge. You bring up this whole idea of, we live in a day and age where unfortunately, with all of the technology at our fingertips, we are just seeing so many Christian leaders fall by the wayside. And I don't say that with any degree of pride or
Yeah.
arrogance, because, but for the grace of God, I can go down that road very easily. But it's interesting, at least in the cases that I know of, the people that I know of who have just had to do a massive reset on their life, the common denominator is no friendships.
Mm.
There was just no one that they really let in real time and say, look, I'm struggling. And by the way, we can't keep anybody accountable. You know how many accountability groups I've sat in, and
Yes.
only to discover that the person was kind of nodding their head and signing off on things, but just secretly doing something else. Accountability is not on the person asking me questions. I'm the one who has to, in very deep transparency, open up in a spirit of truthfulness and invite accountability in. Without that, I have no hopes of ever being held accountable to anything in my life. So, yeah, I go back to thoughtfulness, I go back to intentionality. And I think all of those things, fun, enjoyment, laughter, intentionality, prayer, I think all of that stuff gets mixed in.
Yeah, that I would agree with that. All of that is part of this really complicated dynamic of trying to understand relationships. This conversation is so important because I feel like so much of our life gets, I don't want to say wasted, I don't want to throw around a term like that, but we experience a lot of pain, I think, because of misunderstandings in relationships and even misunderstanding the nature of the relationship
Mm,
and
mm,
even misunderstanding like or not giving it enough time to really say, yeah, I won't really know if this person is a true friend until this kind of time has passed, or I'm thinking in this way and we've had these kinds of conversations. People get attached and then they get hurt because it's too much or the relationship isn't defined. And it makes me wonder how much our cultural expectations around friendships, around transparency, around authenticity, like, especially I'm thinking about in church, because we're talking all the time, like, hey, be authentic, be transparent. God is here. Like, this is what he wants. Or I'll give you an example, like, be real. Your brokenness is good, right? We talk about brokenness a lot. And I love the fact that we can talk about that. And then yet sometimes though, I've seen I've seen interactions that happen when someone is too transparent or they get too much too quick and they make other people feel uncomfortable within a relationship, and then this kind of transparency and this brokenness, it almost becomes like someone's license to uh, be however they want, act however they want, not really consider others when they're sharing things. And then it can create a lot of relational tension. I don't know how much, like, how much have you seen that in your work, this kind of, where there's too much, too quick, and it's almost like we need to take a step back and just be a little bit more intentional and slow about how we're moving into these kinds of relationships.
yeah, the thing I kept thinking about as you were talking is if you're going to try to foster an environment of authenticity and transparency, then your restoration um, ethos, your restoration systems, your commitment to restore people who have fallen had better be on point. I think the reason why there is so much church hurt and the reason why the church does so bad at cultivating an environment of authenticity
Hmm.
and transparency is because we look around and see the terrible track record the church has in handling its broken, fallen people. So I can't say be transparent, be authentic, and then when you do so, but you sin and you do something inappropriate, I come down really hard on you and don't do the work of restoring you. Now, it goes without saying, there are some things that if a person does that we're going to have to take restoration off the table. And here I'm thinking of things that are criminal in nature. We get all that. I'm just talking in general of the church's horrible track record at restoring the broken and the fallen. And people are looking around and they're taking note of that. And inevitably, what that does to a person is it just makes them put the guards up. and just say, I don't think this is a safe place for me.
Yeah, because I think about someone who starts off, say, they start off as a new Christian. They come in, they're confessing all these things. They're they have all this support, and then as they grow and they still have the same issues, or if they come out in different ways, then eventually someone has grown, or they're a Christian now, or they're in it, or whatever they're supposed to be, mature, however we think about that, and then they still have these same issues, and then all of a sudden something is taken away or something. Well, I'll give you like an example. Like I've heard several times where someone in an LGBTQ kind of lifestyle comes in, they come to know Christ, they're confessing Jesus, everything is accepting, people are loving them, and then all of a sudden they realize that they can't have this leadership role or do that, or all of a sudden like things change, and they didn't realize when they changed, and they didn't like, wait, what happened? And so how do we do that well? I mean, how do we accept someone in all of their flaws and yet challenge them to grow and set boundaries on these relationships, not only corporately but even in our own lives? I mean, I have family, and people that are very close to me that are in the LGBTQ community, and it has been a huge point of tension, in many ways, about how the church, what to do with that, what God thinks about that, all that. And I'm not saying asking you to speak on that, but just more giving it as an example of how people can feel like they can come and confess, because we say everyone's welcome, but then it's like, oh wait, but this friendship, it has conditions on it. And I guess that's any friendship. I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just follow your advice and not speak directly to the analogy because I think it points to a greater point, and that is you get into relationship with anybody, you're going to see parts of them that you disagree with. They're going to see
Yes.
parts of you that they're going to disagree with. I mean, that is the biggest barrier to friendships is a little three-letter word with I right in the middle of it. It's called sin. Um, and so I think that's important. And those things need to be worked through. And friendship is there's a deep level of maturity to experience enduring friendship. And a part of the work that comes with maturity is challenging the other person at times when I see those areas, doing it the right way, speaking the truth in love, asking hard questions, doing the work of getting clarity. But also, the hard work of enduring friendship is being able to be asked those tough questions, to not shut down emotionally, to work past um, whatever offenses I may feel when I feel like you're poking and prodding in me. Because again, if God's primary way of shaping us is through other people, that shaping process is going to be uncomfortable at times. And so to be able to, Proverbs talks about faithful are the wounds of a friend. And I just feel like in a culture of niceness, we are too shy about having those go there moments. Like I just feel like we need to go there. Now you got to be careful. Some personalities, they want to have a hard conversation all the time. That gets old really quick. You have to be wise and discerning. Not everything needs to be talked about. Not everything needs to be talked about right now. We understand all that. But there's a hard work um, in sharpening one another. There's an uncomfortable work there that we've got to push through. You know now I'll speak to your analogy. My wife and I have some great friends. A lesbian couple. They're married. Um, I actually write about them in one of our books. And they came to me one day wanting me to perform their renewal of their vows. And I was like, can I say something to you? Am I allowed to think differently about something without being called a bigot? And
Hmm.
that led to a beautiful conversation. I could have
I
lied to
like that.
them. I could have gone ahead and done it. And I think I get this from Jesus. Jesus's whole model in how he engaged people relationally that made choices that he didn't just disagree with, but were actually sinful choices, is this paradigm
Right.
of acceptance versus approval.
Hmm.
Jesus accepted everyone, but obviously he didn't approve of their behavior. So for the woman caught in adultery, he says, "Go in
Yes.
peace." There's a sense of acceptance. He actually protects her from the religious leaders. But then he
Yes.
says, "And sin no more."
Hmm.
Clearly, he's articulating, "I am not approving of the decisions you've been making." And so that's the tension we have to feel. Last thing I'll say, another paradigm thing that's helpful in relationships is this whole grace and truth kind of paradigm. John says, "When I saw Jesus, I
Yes.
saw a man full of grace and truth." I think naturally all of us are weighted to one side or the other. There's just some of us who are very truth driven, very little
Yes.
grace. There's other people very grace driven, very little
Yes.
truth. Truth
Yes.
without grace is condemnation. Grace without truth is compromise. Caleb
Hmm.
Kaltenbach uses an analogy of a rubber band, and he holds one end of it. He says, if you only hold one end of the rubber band, on either end, it's limp. There's no power to it. He goes, the real power of a rubber band, and then he kind of presses against its two extremes. He says, is when you hold the two in tension. And his point is the real power of a Christian relationally is when we hold grace and truth in
I
tension.
like that. I like that.
And I think that's what we have to do. And to be quite honest with you, you will lose some friendships when you do that.
Yeah. Yes.
And you have to be okay with that, as gut wrenching as that is. When you make the commitment that in grace, I'm going to ask you some hard questions, we're going to have some truth encounters, there's a risk involved. And we talk about that in the book. And part of that risk is the person on the other side of the table having coffee with you is going to tap out. And they could very well say, I can't do this. Okay, that's a risk. But it's a risk worth taking.
So, how do you handle that when someone says, I can't do this anymore? How do you maintain the trust in relationships in general, that they're worth having, friendships? And how do you work through basically the ending of a relationship? How do you end it well?
Oh, it's hard.
Maybe it's two questions. Sorry, maybe just real quick, it's two. One is how do you do it when you're on the receiving side? Someone's ended it. And then on the other side, when you realize that you need to end or redefine the relationship.
You know, especially if we're dealing with, the Anam Caras, the soul friends, those are so tough and gut wrenching. It's almost like
Yes.
you go through the stages of grief, right?
Yeah.
Um, Someone once said, be slow to make friends and be slower still to walk away from friendships.
Wow.
And so and I think that's Romans 12:18, right? Romans 12:18 says, as best as you can, be at peace with all people. And so the thing that helps me sleep at night is, did I do the best that I could to make this relationship work? Knowing, and Romans 12:18 has a loophole, as best as you can. Why?
Mm.
Because Paul understands it takes two to have a healthy relationship. And there are plenty of times when I'm doing my best, even apologizing, confessing, saying, I'm sorry. Can we work this out? But if that other person isn't as equally committed to the process, a relationship just can't happen. So how do I work through it? I come back to that question. Did I do my best to make this work? And I think that's where you have to land on this.
So I love that. I want to bring out attention, right? So you have a church community. Just imagine any church community. You know that what holds it together is relationships, variously defined, but relationships in the ways, people feeling isolated. I can't, I guess I can say this with confidence. Most people won't go somewhere for too long without feeling some kind of relational connection. The isolation is just it will make it not worth it. But then so you have these like these this web of connections, and a lot of them are Christians, right? If they're in a Christian community. And then you also have this like sense where we want to make more friendships. We want to test the waters, and we also want to have some kind of relational capital and friendship with people that don't know Christ, that think differently than us. We want to have some kind of, whether it's evangelistic, whether it's just like, hey, like this is part of God's mission to be salt and light in the world. How, where do you kind of come down, and how do you work through the makeup of those 3 to 5? Are they for the believer, for the Christian? Are they all to be Christian? Do they exert too much influence to have, say, a Muslim, an atheist, a Hindu, just an agnostic within that? I mean, I guess at some level you can't help it, right? You connect with certain people, but yeah, maybe I've just already answered the question. I mean, asked the question, but it's like this tension of like we want people that don't know Christ to come to know Christ, but we also want to be very careful about who we let into the inner circle.
Oh, for
How do
sure. So
we kind of
yeah,
manage that?
I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think we can live on mission in the way of Jesus, who was known as the friend of sinners. And I think we can at the same time cultivate healthy relationships like he did with the 12 and specifically Peter, James, and John. I think we can do both. Um, when you talk about who we let in, remember the idea of the Anam Cara is it's a soul level friendship. It is, I am laying
Hmm.
myself bare and inviting you into the deepest part of who I am. But the problem with doing that with a person who doesn't share the deepest part of who you are, which is your relationship with Christ, there's just
Yeah.
not going to be that connection. But I don't want anybody to hear me say that having or seeking to have that soul level friendship with a non believer is wrong. I think that would be overstepping my bounds. I'm not going to put that on the same level as a marriage. However, Paul's instructions in to married people is to not be unequally yoked. And I feel like the deepest human friendship there can ever be is between a man and a wife. And I do see the wisdom, practically speaking, in both the husband and the wife sharing a deep personal abiding commitment to Christ. I think that's just the bedrock of a flourishing relationship. So outside of that marriage covenant, and we're just talking two friends trying to go deep with each other, I don't know how you do that when there's not a mutual commitment to Christ.
Hmm. Yeah, I definitely empathize with what you're saying.
Yeah.
So, where is the role of forgiveness and reconciliation in friendships? Like, how do we do it well? Whether we're the offender or the one being offended. What do we do? How do we keep regular practices of forgiveness and reconciliation in relationships? What role do they play in strong and enduring relationships?
Yeah, forgiveness and reconciliation, you know, in one sense, they're linked, right? You can't be reconciled without forgiving.
Hmm.
But in another sense, um, the scripture says they're very different because you can forgive without being reconciled, right? So when we talk about Romans 12:18, as best as you can be at peace with all people, there is a loophole there, right? As best as you can,
As best
meaning
as you can.
meaning there will be times I do my best and the other person's not matching my effort. They're not as committed to the relationship. It just doesn't work out because it takes two. But when it comes to forgiveness, there is no loophole. That's Matthew chapter 18, 70
Hmm.
times 7. And so I think that's important. Tim Keller says in his wonderful book, Forgive, the whole reason why we forgive is to leave the door open to the possibility of relationship, right?
Hmm.
And so when a person wrongs me, I have the joyful biblical obligation of forgiving them. It's literally sending away the debt. It is literally releasing them of the debt. And there's no loophole to that. And forgiveness is what I do out of obedience and love of Christ, but it's also what I do for my own sake as well. There's a freedom and release that I experience when I let go of the offense. And so I've got to let it go, and I have to do it to keep the possibility of a relationship open. But forgiveness is a point, but building trust and reconciling, that is very much a process. And I would say to the person who's been wounded, who's been offended, who has done an incredibly hard thing, and that is to forgive, you got to be patient with yourself and give yourself time to work the process of building trust and reconciling and repairing the relationship.
That's so good. What are ways that Christian communities and churches can facilitate the development of enduring, value driven friendships among their members, the people that come? What can we do as communities to help facilitate those kinds of relationships?
Well, I think one is just preach and teach on the value of relationship. And a part of what that means is doing the very unpopular thing of going against the culture of individualism, which runs so rampant in the West. I think having a robust theology and philosophy of ministry that talks about stewarding technology in a very healthy way that's not necessarily legalistic. I don't know how we talk about discipleship in our common cultural moment without addressing technology. I think having a robust communal relational discipleship framework. I think discipleship here in the West is very, very individual based. When we talk about discipleship here in the West, we tend to talk about how I can have a better quiet time, how I can have a better prayer time. It's very much me centered, but discipleship really emerges in the East. And Jesus, when he came, the first thing he does is he puts a group of people together and they do life with one another. It's very communal, right? If you see Paul in the book of Acts, very rarely do we catch Paul by himself. He's with a team, a community of people. And I think we need to restore that vision of communal engagement with one another. That phrase, one another, it is exactly probably the most prominent phrase in the New Testament, used over 120 times. Love one another, pray
Mm.
for one another, forgive one another. So we got to get back to that, and that's got to really be taught and really baked into the culture. It's an anti-culture kind of thing that we're doing, and that is to really ring the bell and say, you can't do this alone. You have to, like, friendships are not kind of electives, it's core curriculum. It's core curriculum. And ringing that bell constantly, I think, is a huge thing we can do.
I really, really like that. This is my last more philosophical question. Then we have just one practical one at the end. But what do you hope the book accomplishes? What kind of stories would you imagine hearing that, oh, they've read the book, now this has happened, and this accomplished the purpose that I had set forth in writing the book?
I think I should hope that it would restore hope for people who have been hurt to engage the beauty of friendship. People who had given up on the project of friendship um, already, for them to say, I want to get back into the game and extend myself. I should hope that that would be one of the things that people come away with.
That's so great. So, how can people follow you and how can they get the book? And yeah, how can they kind of interact with what you have going on?
Yeah, social media platforms are probably the best way to get to me. I'm not on X. I just got off of there. I am on Instagram at Loritts, Loritts. I'm on Instagram Threads, and I'm on Facebook. So if you just type my name, Bryan with a Y, Loritts, Loritts, you can access me there. You can actually go to my website as well, bryanloritts.com.
That's great. And where can people pick up a copy of Enduring Friendship?
They can go to Amazon, wherever books are sold. Probably, things like Amazon or Barnes and Noble online would be the best, most efficient way to get them.
That's great. Well, folks, this has been Dr. Bryan Loritts and his new book. We're talking about Enduring Friendship, Sticking Together in an Age of Unfriending. Bryan, it's been such a pleasure having this conversation with you today. Thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
Absolutely. And to all our viewers, thank you guys for joining, and we'll see you next time. And until then, take care.